distracts me.' 'I don't know,' said Newman. 'Small things offer. They would pay the rent, and more, but you wouldn't like them. No, you could hardly be expected to undergo it. No, no.' 'What could I hardly be expected to undergo?' asked Nicholas, raising his eyes. 'Show me in this wide waste of London any honest means by which I could even defray the weekly hire of this poor room, and see if I shrink from resorting to them. Undergo! I have undergone too much, my friend, to feel pride or squeamishness now. Except,' added Nicholas hastily, after a short silence, 'except such squeamishness as is common honesty, and so much pride as constitutes self-respect. I see little to choose between assistant to a brutal pedagogue, and toad eater to a mean and ignorant upstart, be he member or no member.' 'I hardly know whether I should tell you what I heard this morning, or not,' said Newman. 'Has it reference to what you said just now?' asked Nicholas. 'It has.' 'Then, in Heaven's name, my good friend, tell it me,' said Nicholas. 'For God's sake, consider my deplorable condition, and while I promise to take no step without taking counsel with you, give me at least a vote in my own behalf.' Moved by this entreaty, Newman stammered forth a variety of most unaccountable and entangled sentences, the upshot of which was, that Mrs. Kenwigs had examined him at great length that morning, touching the origin of his acquaintance with, and the whole life, adventures, and pedigree of, Nicholas. That Newman had parried these questions as long as he could, but being at length hard pressed and driven into a corner, had gone so far as to admit that Nicholas was a tutor of great accomplishments, involved in some misfortunes which he was not at liberty to explain, and bearing the name of Johnson. That Mrs. Kenwigs, impelled by gratitude or ambition, or maternal pride, or maternal love, or all four powerful motives conjointly, had taken secret conference with Mr. Kenwigs, and had finally returned to propose that Mr. Johnson should instruct the four Miss Kenwigses in the French language, as spoken by natives, at the weekly stipend of 5 shillings, current coin of the realm, being at the rate of 1 shilling per week per each Miss Kenwigs, and 1 shilling over, until such time as the baby might be able to take it out in grammar. Which, unless I am very much mistaken,' observed Mrs. Kenwigs, in making the proposition, 'will not be very long, for such clever children, Mr. Noggs, never were born into this world, I do believe.' 'There,' said Newman, 'that's all. It's beneath you, I know, but I thought that perhaps you might.' 'Might!' cried Nicholas, with great alacrity. 'Of course I shall. I accept the offer at once. Tell the worthy mother so without delay, my dear fellow, and that I am ready to begin whenever she pleases.' Newman hastened, with joyful steps, to inform Mrs. Kenwigs of his friend's acquiescence, and soon returning, brought back word that they would be happy to see him in the first floor as soon as convenient; that Mrs. Kenwigs had, upon the instant, sent out to secure a second-hand French grammar and dialogues, which had long been fluttering in the sixpenny box at the bookstall round the corner, and that the family, highly excited at the prospect of this addition to their gentility, wished the initiatory lesson to come off immediately. And here it may be observed that Nicholas was not, in the ordinary sense of the word, a man of high spirit. He would resent an affront to himself, or interpose to redress a wrong offered to another, as boldly and freely as any knight that ever set lance in rest; but he lacked that peculiar excess of coolness and great-minded selfishness which invariably distinguish gentlemen of high spirit. In truth, for our own part, we are disposed to look upon such gentlemen as being rather encumbrances than otherwise in rising families, happening to be acquainted with several whose spirit prevents their settling down to any grovelling occupation, and only displays itself in a tendency to cultivate mustachios, and look fierce. And although mustachios and ferocity are both very pretty things in their way, and very much to be commended, we confess to a desire to see them bred at the owner's proper cost, rather than at the expense of low-spirited people. Nicholas, therefore, not being a high-spirited young man according to common parlance, and deeming it a greater degradation to borrow for the supply of his necessities from Newman Noggs than to teach French to the little Kenwigses for 5 shillings a week, accepted the offer with the alacrity already described, and betook himself to the first floor with all convenient speed. Here he was received by Mrs. Kenwigs with a genteel air, kindly intended to assure him of her protection and support, and here too he found Mr. Lillyvick and Miss Petowker, the 4 Miss Kenwigses on their form of audience, and the baby in a dwarf porter's chair with a deal tray before it, amusing himself with a toy horse without a head, the said horse being composed of a small wooden cylinder, not unlike an Italian iron, supported on 4 crooked pegs, and painted in ingenious resemblance of red wafers set in blacking. 'How do you do, Mr. Johnson?' said Mrs. Kenwigs. 'Uncle, Mr. Johnson.' 'How do you do, sir?' said Mr. Lillyvick, rather sharply, for he had not known what Nicholas was on the previous night, and it was rather an aggravating circumstance if a tax collector had been too polite to a teacher. 'Mr. Johnson is engaged as private master to the children, uncle,' said Mrs. Kenwigs. 'So you said just now, my dear,' replied Mr. Lillyvick. 'But I hope,' said Mrs. Kenwigs, drawing herself up, 'that will not make them proud, but that they will bless their own good fortune, which has borne them superior to common people's children. Do you hear, Morleena?' 'Yes, ma,' replied Miss Kenwigs. 'And when you go out in the streets or elsewhere, I desire that you don't boast of it to the other children,' said Mrs. Kenwigs, 'and that if you must say anything about it, you don't say no more than, "We've got a private master comes to teach us at home, but we ain't proud because ma says it's sinful. Do you hear, Morleena?" 'Yes, ma,' replied Miss Kenwigs again. 'Then mind you recollect, and do as I tell you,' said Mrs. Kenwigs. 'Shall Mr. Johnson begin, uncle?' 'I am ready to hear, if Mr. Johnson is ready to commence, my dear,' said the collector, assuming the air of a profound critic. 'What sort of language do you consider French, sir?' 'How do you mean?' asked Nicholas. 'Do you consider it a good language, sir?' said the collector. 'A pretty language? A sensible language?' 'A pretty language, certainly,' replied Nicholas; 'and as it has a name for everything, and admits of elegant conversation about everything, I presume it's a sensible one.' 'I don't know,' said Mr. Lillyvick, doubtfully. 'Do you call it a cheerful language, now?' 'Yes,' said Nicholas, 'I should say it was, certainly.' 'It's very much changed since my time, then,' said the collector. 'Very much.' 'Was it a dismal one in your time?' asked Nicholas, scarcely able to repress a smile. 'Very,' replied Mr. Lillyvick, with some vehemence of manner. 'It's the war time that I speak of. The last war. It may be a cheerful language. I should be sorry to contradict anybody, but I can only say that I've heard the French prisoners, who are natives and ought to know how to speak it, talking in such a dismal manner, that it made one miserable to hear them. Aye, that I have. 50 times, sir, 50 times.' Mr. Lillyvick was waxing so cross that Mrs. Kenwigs thought it expedient to motion to Nicholas not to say anything, and it was not until Miss Petowker had practised several blandishments to soften the excellent old gentleman that he deigned to break silence by asking, 'What's the water in French, sir?' 'Low,' replied Nicholas. 'Ah!' said Mr. Lillyvick, shaking his head mournfully. 'I thought as much. Low, eh? I don't think anything of that language. Nothing at all.' 'I suppose the children may begin, uncle?' said Mrs. Kenwigs. 'Oh yes, they may begin, my dear,' replied the collector, discontentedly. 'I have no wish to prevent them.' This permission being conceded, the 4 Miss Kenwigses sat in a row, with their tails all one way, and Morleena at the top, while Nicholas, taking the book, began his preliminary explanations. Miss Petowker and Mrs. Kenwigs looked on in silent admiration, broken only by the whispered assurances of the latter that Morleena would have it all by heart in no time, and Mr. Lillyvick regarded the group with frowning and attentive eyes, lying in wait for something upon which he could open a fresh discussion on the language. Chapter 17